Hi everyone, I'm Young Kim in Geography and Western Poverty. Thanks for coming to the Western Poverty Week on Urban Challenges event. This is our third talk of the week, and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we will have two talks on US cities. But today, it's about Latin American cities. So today's speaker, Dr. Layton, is an assistant professor of political science, and he received his PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University in 2015. Dr. Layton's research focuses on the structure and origins of political legitimacy in Latin America and the relationship between social policy and political empowerment. He's published his research in several leading political science journals, including World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, and Latin American Politics and Society. And he is a country team leader for Brazil on America's Barometer study conducted by the Latin American Public Opinion Project. So today's talk is based on that survey. So it's good. And without further ado, I will let you hear from Dr. Layton.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Young, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today and to share a little bit about my recent research. As Dr. Young Kim said, some of this is based on my work with the America's Barometer through the Latin American Public Opinion Project, but it's also based on some recent field work that I did down in Brazil over the summer. And so I'm going to be presenting a little bit and some initial sort of findings and conclusions from that. I should say there's a little disclaimer here at the beginning. This is all very much a work in progress. This is research that's evolving and beginning to sort of build and accelerate as I think more about these issues and these topics of how urban spaces are shaping Latin America in today, and particularly more recently with some of the economic and political crises that have been happening specifically in Brazil, but also in other countries around the region. So today with this presentation, what I want to do is walk through a few questions. What is it that people who live in urban spaces in Latin America perceive as being some of the biggest problems and challenges that they face? Why is it that some of the urbanization that's occurred in Latin America over the last several decades hasn't ultimately resulted in a lot of the prosperity and security that we've seen in high-income, more developed countries? And what role might politics have to play in all of this? As a political scientist, as you might imagine, my conclusions are going to be that politics are really rather important in explaining some of this story. So with that, what I want to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of the presentation laying some context and groundwork just to make sure that we're all on the same page and understanding where all this is happening in terms of people responding to events that are happening around them and where Latin America has been in terms of its urbanization. Okay. So with that, I want to start with a nice little picture here for you. So this is a graph based on World Bank data, just showing the percentage of the total population in each of the major geographical regions of the world in terms of what percentage of that population lives in an urban area or an area that's defined as urban. And so across the world as a whole, as of 2008, more than 50% of the world's population lives in urban spaces. And the United Nations projects that by the year 2050, that's going to rise to about 66%. So in other words, 2 out of every 3 people in the world are going to be living in a space that's defined as urban. Okay, so this is a growing area of interest in a project that has global reach and global implications. Okay? But let's look at Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. As you can see in this comparison, Latin America is one of the regions in the world that has the highest rate of urbanization, on par with the high-income countries and the North American region that we typically see as being sort of the epitome of modern urban living. Right? So Latin America, right? It's an urban region, right? And other regions, a lot of that growth, where we're going to get to that 66%, it's actually probably not going to be happening as much in Latin America and the Caribbean, but that growth is going to be happening in South Asia, East Asia, and Africa. Okay? But Latin America sort of went first. Right? As of 1961, over half of Latin Americans lived in urban spaces. Right? So this is not something that's new for Latin America. Latin America has long been a region defined by its urbanism and the urban experience. Despite what you might have seen in popular television and movies and things where it's often portrayed as quite the opposite, right? Being sort of a rural place or jungle living. Most people in Latin America, by far, 4 out of every 5 are living in an urban area. Okay, so that's the first thing that we want to establish. The other thing that has happened parallel to this, right? And the reason that urbanization is of interest for folks in political science is because of something called modernization theory. Right? This is a theory that emerged in the 1950s, 1960s, about the time that Latin America was beginning to really rapidly urbanize. That said that urbanization is part of this larger package of modernity. Right? It's industrialization, urbanization, growing wealth, growing levels of education for your population. All these things kind of come together and converge to create the necessary preconditions for the establishment of a prosperous society and more particularly for a democratic society. Right? These are sort of fundamental things that all come together. And while there's been a lot to criticize about modernization theory and its predictions, there's still something about the city that is seen as sort of that link between modernity and urban space is still very strong today. Right? And this link between the democratic experience and urban spaces is still very strong today. And in fact, if we look on paper, look around the Latin American region, the same time that it was beginning this upsurge in urbanization was also the time that we begin to see over several decades a move towards more democratic forms of government, to the point where today most of Latin America would be considered democratic, to varying degrees, granted, but still a place where democracy, democratic values, and modernity seem to be converging and coming together in really important ways. So where's the puzzle here? Where's something that would make us a little bit curious and have us probing a little bit further to better understand the urban experience in Latin America? And why is it that Latin America in particular is someplace that we're going to look to find some interesting questions about the urban experience? Well, first of all, at the same time that this urbanization and democratization has happened, the predicted gains in terms of prosperity and security have not necessarily accompanied those trends in Latin America. So while, again, this is that first graph I was showing you, right? Latin America, urban region. On the right-hand side here, what we have is a portrayal of the average income in each of the different regions on a per capita basis. And so as we see, Latin America, right, falls well behind the high-income countries in the North American region. It even falls behind some of the other less urbanized regions of the world. Right? So at the same time that Latin America is urbanized, it's not providing that same level of prosperity for its citizens on average as other countries are, or as other regions are. We've also got concerns about insecurity in Latin America. There's actually going to be an interesting talk this evening, I may or may not be able to attend, about crime and violence in Latin America. But, so if you want to look for that, I encourage you to look for that. But, this is another area of concern for Latin America, right? At the same time that other places that are highly urbanized have been able to provide a degree of domestic security and tranquility for their residents and citizens, Latin America really struggles in providing that same level of security. And maybe this has something to do with the difficulty in creating sustainable growth. Right? When people feel insecure, it's very difficult for them to invest at the same level as they might otherwise. Right? And so Latin America really stands apart. Right? And this is just in terms of measures of homicide rate. And there, we might have some concerns about how homicides are reported and what those numbers actually represent. But I think that there's still something real here that we need to consider in terms of the concerns that people might have in terms of their experience of living in urban spaces in Latin America. But what is it that citizens themselves actually perceive? And those are all data from governments or large international organizations. What is it that the citizens themselves perceive as being the most important problems Well, unsurprisingly, given the magnitude of the security problem, given the lack of economic prosperity and development, citizens themselves also point to these kinds of issues as being some of their most pressing concerns. When we ask them questions like, in your opinion, what is the most serious problem faced by the country today? And across Latin America, what we see is predominantly questions of public order, so crime, drug trafficking, violence, sense of insecurity. Right? These are the kinds of issues that people talk about. Problems with the economy, unemployment, inflation, just overall general economic crisis in general, right? So all these kinds of issues are the things that are on the top of people's minds when we ask them, okay, if you just tell me the most important problem right now, we understand that there's a lot of problems, but if you just tell me the one that's on the top of your mind, these are the things that people kind of come up with. And I'm showing you here, breaking it out by residents of large cities and by residents of other smaller cities and rural areas, just to show a couple of things. First of all, the pattern actually is pretty similar. Right? The same kinds of issues come up in both spaces, right? Both in questions of terms of public order and economy. Those are the top two. The rankings are a little bit different. It seems like, at least as of 2014, folks in rural area were maybe a little bit more concerned with economic issues than were the people in the urban areas where public order questions were at the top of their mind. But all in all, there's not actually that much difference between these spaces. People are having a very similar kind of experience wherever they live in the country. So what is it specifically that we might be interested in the urban space? Remember, I was telling you about this connection between urbanization and modern life, right? Modernity. Right? We're concerned about that. And one of the things that I think might be an issue that we want to consider and follow up on is that folks who live in urban spaces have maybe different expectations than people living in a small city or a rural area, where you might expect there to be poor level of public services or a lack of high quality schools or education. If you're going to the city, you're going there in an expectation of getting access to that modern life and the opportunities that the city affords. If life there falls short of those expectations, you may end up feeling worse off overall about how conditions are going generally. And so that's something that we want to look at a little bit further as we get into this story. I want to break this down not just into these general categories, but very specifically. Right? So when we ask this question, we ask as an open-ended question. We don't give people a set fixed response so they give us back. We're asking them, just off the top of your head, tell us anything that's on your mind. What is it that's the most important problem? And so people tell us things like, oh, it's crime or violence or a lack of security. They use different words. Right? And the words that people use matter. And so we want to also understand breaking it out, not just by general categories, but specifically what are the things that people say. Right? And so in the large cities across Latin America, crime, almost twice as many people say crime as opposed to just sort of general economic crisis. But remember, when we start adding these things together, right, if we add economic crisis to unemployment, right, it begins to shape a little bit different picture. But these are the kinds of issues. These are the things specifically that are on people's minds when we go into these areas. But this is for the region as a whole, right? Taking residents of all the large cities of Latin America, right? Generally speaking, these are the kinds of things that they're worried about. We do also want to acknowledge there's considerable variation across the different countries. And I don't expect you to be able to read these numbers. I know they're very small, very tiny. But I hope you can just at least see the pattern in the mosaic, how it changes across each of the different countries, right? The relative weight of economy or public order, public services, governance, and corruption. And so Latin America, I want to make this point very clearly, is a very diverse region. And this is an important takeaway point. While in general we may think about some of these questions and concerns being broadly applicable to the region, we also want to understand the individual experience of residents of distinct countries. Okay? And for that purpose, for the remainder of the talk, I'm actually going to delve into very specifically the case of Brazil, which is one where, as I said, I've just done some recent field work. I've been down there, I've experienced it in the field. I can give maybe some insight that I hope would be of interest to at least some of you here in the room about this particular country. But just understanding, right, that there's a variety of experiences across Latin America. One of the reasons I love studying this region so much is because there's so much to explore and understand and so many questions to ask. So we're going to leave this aside for now, and we're going to go in and specifically focus on the case of Brazil. So I'm going to give a little bit of a background, right, to the urban experience in Brazil. As with the Latin American region as a whole, right, Brazil transitioned to being a majority urban country between 1960 and 1970. And as you can see, right, that growth continued to accelerate, and the ratio between urban and rural areas has continued to increase since that time. In fact, I would expect that when the 2020 census results come out from Brazil, we're probably going to see a ratio of around 6-to-1 for urban residents to rural residents. I'd expect this number to probably be somewhere around 180 million, and maybe the rural residents more or less where it's at right now. And so, that would give us a ratio about 6-to-1. And again, this is part of this urbanization that's happened not just in Brazil, but across Latin America. Brazil has been a large driver of that, a large force in growing in the urban spaces in particular. But at the same time, Brazil has had this sort of boom and bust cycle in its economy, right? Where we see constant acceleration and growth, or not so much acceleration, but sort of a constant level of growth in Brazil in urban areas. The economy has not followed that same trajectory. Right? There's been decades like the 1970s, where there's been fantastic levels of growth happening in Brazil. People talked about Brazil in the 1970s as being the Brazilian miracle. Again, between 2000 and 2010, there was a fantastic cover on The Economist with that Christ statue, if you know that statue from Rio, right? Blasting off as if it's a rocket ship. It's a fantastic cover. Everybody excited about Brazil. The Brazilian economy is just taking off. Finally, Brazil is realizing its potential, right? We're getting over the lost decade of the 1980s. We're going to, Brazil's going forward and nobody can stop it. Well, until, 2014 hits, and all of a sudden you have negative growth in the country of 4%, negative 4% for 2 years, and this year, not quite sure the direction it's going to be. It might still be negative. Maybe it's turning around. So you get this situation where, all this optimism, you think it's taking off, and then poof, the economy collapses. And for people in the urban spaces, this is particularly painful, right? Especially as people have moved into the urban areas, right? Again, they're urbanizing especially rapidly across this whole time period. And when these opportunities dry up during the economic crises of the 1980s and now more recently, people have this sort of sense of betrayal. Right? Somehow, this dream that's been promised of modern life and the opportunity that urban areas are going to bring to me and my family dry up. And that can be very frustrating to people. There's also concern about rising levels of insecurity in Brazil, as with much of the rest of Latin America. And strangely enough, some of this increase, right? And so here's the recorded homicides in Brazil from 1980 to 2010, sort of increasing, along the lines that, as the same, we were increasing urbanization. Well, homicides are also going up. Interestingly enough, a lot of that increase due to homicide by firearm in the aftermath of the democratic transition in Brazil. And there's a lot of sort of backstory and reasons that we might talk about with that. But again, it's this overall sense that things are not going as well as we might have hoped that they would have. This trend in violent crime is going the wrong direction. And a lot of this, strangely enough, happening at the same time where in countries like the United States, there's been a declining rate of violent crime, even in urban areas. Right? So Brazil seems to be going the wrong direction again, on one more indicator. And just to give another perspective on this, again, from the survey data, a more broadly based question asks, have you been a victim of any type of crime in the past 12 months? That is, have you been a victim of robbery, burglary, assault, fraud, blackmail, extortion, violent threats, or any other type of crime in the past 12 months? And this is data going back to 2010. Right? About 15% of the Brazilian population saying, yes, I've been a victim of crime. Sudden spike in 2017, remember, at the same time of this more recent economic crisis in Brazil. Now we think there's somewhere between 20 and 25% of people in Brazil who've been a victim of crime in the last year. Think about what that means to people and that sense of insecurity that gives you. It means there's a really good probability that somebody close to you, somebody you know, if you yourself have not been a victim of crime, the possibility of knowing somebody who's been a victim of crime is pretty high, the likelihood that you know someone. Think about the sense of insecurity overall that gives to society. So what does this do in the context of Brazil? What do people think, especially for those that live in the largest cities? What are the big problems? Well, this is interesting because what we find is that there's actually some variation in this over time. I mean, we've talked about how different countries have different sense of what the problems are. Well, in the same country, you can get very different responses depending on when you ask this question. What is the most serious problem in your country right now? We'll go back to 2014, in the lead up to the FIFA World Cup, before the Rio Olympics, and all the glamour and global attention that all that brought. There was a sort of general overall sense of optimism. There had been some protests. People were a little unhappy with how the money was being spent for these large events, but no sign yet of exactly how bad the economic situation was going to be in just a short amount of time. And so back in 2014, go to the large cities, you ask, the number one problem is health services. So people take this as a sign, right? Okay, so maybe there's something happening. There's this urbanization, this modernization. The economy's been growing from 2000 to 2010. A lot of people have moved out of the lower classes into middle class, prosperity. And so now they're expecting more from government. Right? So the health services, right? Okay, all of a sudden, we might actually be able to pay for some health care at the local hospital and the local clinics. But we get there and the service isn't that good, and there's maybe not a bed for when the baby's going to be born, or we have a bad experience at the hospital. And so we want better health care services. We want the government to be doing more with the tax money that we're giving them. It seems like a middle class kind of a demand. Right? It seems like a demand of a country that's really coming into its own of modernizing and moving forward. Of course, violence and, there's this corruption thing here too, and insecurity and drug trafficking in the urban spaces. Remember, there's increasing crime levels and people have been victimized, and so there's still these concerns. But it is interesting that health services is number one in 2014. Look at how different the picture looks in 2017. Right? Number one issue, corruption. Number two, unemployment. Number three, other. And I actually went back to the folks who were working directly with the data, and the response like, okay, so there's a lot of people saying other. What's an other? What's in this category? And they told us, well, actually, there was a non-trivial amount, right, of folks who were answering other, who were telling us everything's wrong. Everything is wrong. And then we say, well, okay, just pick one. We understand that there's a lot of things that are on your mind right now. Just pick one. No, it's everything. Okay, everything. I think that goes into other. Right? So economy and then health services down here. And these are just the top five. There's many more responses that people give us. Right? But this is a very different scenario we're dealing with in 2017. Remember, we've had negative economic growth, this spike in crime, right? But economy seems to be growing in people's concern. What else has been going on in Brazil in this time period? There's been a massive corruption scandal and investigation ongoing in Brazil. Money laundering, people buying off favors, politicians going to jail, something almost unheard of in Brazil prior to this time. And every night on the news, and I'm a witness to this now. I've been down there for a few weeks last summer. Every night on the news, some new report about some new corruption that's been found, including $13 million in suitcases, some stashed in some guy's apartment. Walk in, it's just cash. And there's video of the guys going in. I mean, it's like out of a cartoon. Right? They go in to get the payouts. It's all in cash, these wads of cash. So much cash that doesn't even fit in the guy's briefcase. He's stuffing it into his suit coat pockets. Like literally the cash just pouring out all over. It was like you can imagine him walking out, the wind blows by and it takes a few, 100 real notes with it. Or, it seems like this cartoon. And yet this is the news every night that people are being hammered with. here's what's going on with your politics right now. And it's a concern. People are worried about it. There's something wrong with the system. Something's gone wrong. No more rockets blasting off the top of Rio. No, none of that. Not so much of a happy story. Right? And so there's a little bit of a concern here, what's going on. So let me tell you a little bit about where I was doing this field work. So I was actually in the northern part of Brazil for a few weeks. In the 7th largest city in Brazil, Manaus. It's up in the Amazon region. It was one of the hosts of the 2014 FIFA World Cup and 2016 Rio Olympic soccer matches. In fact, the United States had the misfortune of having to play in the hot and humid climate of Manaus and suffered. And it's also a major industrial center for the region. There's a special tax zone that's been set aside there that's actually attracted a lot of industry and corporations because they get some tax breaks by going there. And that's no small thing in Brazil's tax climate. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of talk to some people there and understand a little bit better what their particular experience has been and what's been on their mind and some of their concerns. So I asked them, what's the most important problem for the city of Manaus? And all these other questions have been talking about things sort of going on at the national level. You expect that what happens to people locally impacts the way that they think about the national politics. But I wanted to know specifically what's going on in their minds in terms of their city, the place that they live and work and interact with their friends, neighbors, and family on a daily basis. Well, I got a lot of different responses. Public administration, there's not a continuity of policy. You go from one administration to the next and they want to change everything. Right? Nobody's willing to just follow through on plans that have been made in the past. You have overpriced public contracts, getting these kickbacks and the bribes. The same kind of dirty politics is going on in Manaus, that's going on in other cities and at the national level. People are concerned about insecurity and violence. A lack of quality public health services, sanitation, health, education, poor infrastructure, and the roads. And let me tell you, I was down there, I was like, whoa, I'm never going to complain about the roads in Athens again. I think we have bad potholes here. Just, take a trip down to Manaus, Brazil, and drive around for a few days. A lack of oversight and regulations, lack of social responsibility, inflation, unemployment, politics and the corruption, and lack of transparency. And this is just from a handful of interviews. And people had a lot to get off their mind. It sort of feels like that everything story that we were talking about before. Right? Where do you even begin to think about this? But something that I was really interested in these conversations I was having was this sort of underlying theme that kept coming up. That as much as they were complaining about all these bad things that were happening, a lot of it seemed to come back to this question of the politics. That somehow the problems with the economy, the problems with insecurity, people were beginning to realize that a lot of that actually had root in the nature of the politics of the country and the city in particular. That somehow this political malfeasance that's happening at these higher levels, right? That what's going on at the top somehow is influencing everything else that comes below. Right? If you've got people skimming off on the public contracts, getting kickbacks and bribes, well, it's diverting public resources. Right? Public resources are being used inefficiently. Right? If you've got folks who are in office who are just sort of incapable or incompetent, right? You begin to have problems in dealing with public services, and that includes things like security, right? The security forces. And all this stuff sort of begins to feel like it's wrapped up in this larger story of what's going on in the politics of the country. While I was there was a special election for the state of Amazonas, which is, Manaus is the capital of that state, to elect a new governor. The previous governor had been taken out of office by the electoral courts in Brazil because he'd been charged and found guilty of doing some vote buying during the previous election. So he'd violated election laws, was removed from office. They had to have a special election for the new governor. I think that was on people's minds as well. Right? So here we've seen this really local, very poignant example. Right? We just lost our governor. We had to have this whole new special election, which cost the the public coffers millions of dollars. And, and for what? To fill out the rest of a one-year term, because both the guy and his vice, governor were caught up in this scandal and were convicted of vote buying. So we, waste our time, we have to give up a whole Sunday, and then, well, guess what? Nobody won in the first round of elections, so then we have to go and hold a second round of elections. So it's another Sunday we have to give up. We could be with our families, but instead we're in line to vote for the new governor. And again, more money, because you have to provide security, you have to provide transportation for all the ballots to get delivered where they need. It's a mess, right? Just to sum it up, right? People are frustrated by this. They get very annoyed at this. And then to top it all off, what I'm hearing from people is it's just all the same people who are running. There's no new voice. There's no new candidate there. They're in this game of musical chairs. Well, today he's going to be the governor. Tomorrow he'll want to be running for mayor of our city. Then he'll be running for the Senate seat. And they'll just be trading places. And it's the same people that we've been hearing about over and over again. And no new options. So is it any wonder, right, that when we ask people how satisfied they are with the way that democracy works in Brazil, that as they've been witnessing these events over the last several years, we've seen a corresponding drop-off, right, in people's sense of satisfaction? I don't think so. It kind of makes sense. People are responding to what's going on around them. And this is potentially something we want to be concerned about. As people are beginning to have this sense of sort of despair and not sure where to go from here. Let me give you a sense of some of the things people were saying to me. And this is what I'm going to call the skeptical, disillusioned perspective. I was asking folks, so what does this all mean for your perceptions and belief in democracy? Well, one woman responded to me, to tell you the truth, we vote to choose a government because we're obligated. So I need to explain. In Brazil, they have compulsory voting. And there's certain penalties attached to not showing up and voting at the polls in an election. So she says, we vote because it's compulsory and we have to come with our voter registration card. And so you have to be able to show on demand when you go into a government office, you have to be able to show proof that you voted in the previous election. Otherwise, you might be denied services or you'd have to pay a fine. And for a lot of people, that fine could be pretty costly. So it's something that, okay, so we'll vote because it's compulsory. And she says, but to tell you the truth, if it were up to me, I would not vote. Because it makes no difference to vote. They, I think she's referring to the politicians, want to win for themselves and not for us. So, kind of sad, right? I mean, it's a real sense of despair here of, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to, how are you supposed to react if you're just a normal person, right? A normal voter who's just being told you have to go to the polls because it's your civic duty, and by the way, if you don't, you'll be fined. And yet, when you get there to the polls, you feel like it's the same people, and they're doing this musical chairs thing. What are you supposed to feel? What are you supposed to say to that? Right? And I think this is some of that frustration coming out. At the same time, there's another perspective here, and I want to share this with you as well. This is what I'm calling practical optimism. It's an optimistic note, but a side of practicality to it as well. Right? So this is another woman, again, speaking with me. She says, I think that democracy is valid, because at the polls, we're able to express our opinion and see what the people really want. Of course, sometimes people choose a good course, and sometimes they choose a bad course. But I think that this is better than an authoritarian, military, or dictatorial government. Right? So this woman is actually able to see what would the alternative be, and to see that alternative as being unacceptable. This is not the direction that we want to go as a country. Yes, there's these terrible things happening, and she acknowledges that at other points in the interview. Right? And there's all these same problems, and she talks about the problem with education and the inability of the government to provide people with that kind of education that they need. But consider the alternative. Right? consider if we weren't doing it this way, what other way would we do it? And that alternative is unacceptable, to go that route. And I should say that I think I would say that I heard more of this perspective than the other one. And I think that in general, if we're looking sort of on average, people, while there's some people who do express this kind of skeptical attitude and really don't see much difference between democracy and the authoritarian past. Maybe because they've erased some of the memory of what it looked like, or because they didn't experience it themselves. There is more of this kind of optimism and recognition that democracy is the way to go, not necessarily the way it's being implemented in Brazil. There's definitely always, in every interview, there was a call for dramatic changes in the way that the politics works. But still, there is this kind of sense of hope that we can fix this. Right? We can find the right kinds of institutions. We can develop the right kinds of incentives. We can change our political culture in this country to make it so that this political malfeasance element is not as accepted as it was in the past. And maybe that way, we can move forward and get ahead as a country. So, who is the least satisfied with Brazil's democracy right now? So I actually ran some numbers. I'm not going to show those to you today. I just want to give you sort of the basic snapshot of what I've found as I've tried to do a more robust analysis of this question. Right? So looking back, right, when we ask people, are you satisfied with the way democracy works in Brazil right now? Remember, we've had this drop off over time. So I wanted to try to understand a little bit better, right? Who is it that's become unsatisfied with democracy in Brazil? And there's some interesting findings out of this. So when we put in people's responses to that question of what the most important problem is in terms, the economy or political order or public services, governance, corruption, or other, everything category, right? What we actually find is that it's the respondents who see issues related to governance and corruption who are the least satisfied. Right? It's not the economy. It's not even the insecurity. Again, I think this is some evidence that underlying all this, people are beginning to see this connection between the politics and what's happening in terms of the outcomes in the country, both economic and security and public services. Right? So it's folks who are really concerned about the governance and corruption piece of it that are least satisfied with the way democracy works. Unsurprisingly, in households where they've lost income over the previous 2 years, also some dissatisfaction. You'd expect that. Political scientists have been talking about this for years. It's called the economic vote. It's the economy, stupid. People's pocketbooks are hurting. They're not going to see things as nice and bright and shiny. Right? They don't like what's going on around them. Okay. Interestingly, women, much less satisfied. And I want to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Residents of large and medium cities relative to small cities and rural areas. Again, I think this comes from that expectation gap that I was talking about earlier. There's higher expectations for what's going to be going on in the medium and larger cities of a country like Brazil. And when things fall short, those people are going to be some of the most disappointed because they had those higher expectations to begin with. And I think that's an important thing to consider. So let me say a little bit more about this piece on the women. So women respondents in our survey significantly less satisfied with the way democracy works in Brazil currently. In fact, this is substantively a really interesting finding and something I need to explore a little bit further. Women are about 40% less likely than men to express satisfaction with the way democracy works in Brazil. It's a huge gap. This is substantively really important. And I want to just show you something here. These are pictures of the mayors of the largest Brazilian cities currently. Current mayors. Maybe you notice a little pattern here. Maybe a couple of patterns. I'm not sure I need to spell it out to you, but I think I will anyway. For a country that prides itself on the diversity of its population and talks about itself as being a racial democracy, there's a remarkable lack of diversity in the photographs up here. Not that there's not any diversity. There is. And actually some interesting exceptions. But still, I think that this photograph in and of itself, about the 28 largest cities, I can't remember how many photographs I got up here, but these are the largest cities in the country and their current mayors. I was looking at some of the data that's made available by the Electoral Commission in Brazil. Among all the potential 2016 candidates for mayor, vice mayor, and municipal councils, 32% were women. Among all the candidates, all the potential candidates for these seats. Among all the elected 2016 municipal officials, that is for mayor, vice mayor, and municipal councils, 13% were women. And among all elected mayors in the 2016 elections, 11.6% were women. None of them in the top, in the largest cities of the country. And in fact, in many cases, there wasn't even an option to elect a woman. None of the final candidates in the second round of election was a woman. In only a handful of cases was there a woman even on the ballot. I think that there might be something there in explaining dissatisfaction among women with the way Brazilian democracy works. Maybe. Right? I have to verify that still. I have to see if there's still something else that might explain it as well. But I think that it's something that speaks volumes, just kind of taking a look at what it looks like. In fact, I was just going to tell you the statistics, and then I came up with this idea. I think there's something about a visual impact here that we can have in understanding where people are perceiving what's going on around them. So just briefly, these are very preliminary conclusions. But there's a few things on my mind as I go back and think over what I've presented to you today. First, I think it is important to point out that alternatives to democratic forms of government are still unacceptable for most Brazilians, even while there are some people who think that it doesn't really matter. In fact, there's some excellent work done that I have my students in my Latin American politics class read by Janice Perlman, where she's gone into some of the communities in Rio de Janeiro and talked with people about this difference between democracy and the authoritarian government. And this is where, that term I talked about, skeptical disillusionment, she talks about it being, a disillusionment with democracy generally. Right? That people in particularly the poorer communities really don't see that much of a difference in their lives between the military government and the current democratic government. It seems like it's all the same thing to them. Their lives are still difficult. They still have trouble getting ahead. Having that social mobility is still a challenge for folks in these communities. Even still, most Brazilians, based on the data and what I've observed myself, would still see a move back to an authoritarian form of government as unacceptable. And that's a good starting point. I think that's important to nurture that kind of attitude and feeling, given the history of what authoritarianism looked like in Brazil. Among those that I talked to, one of the most cited proposed kind of solutions to the crisis is to change the culture of politics, broadening democratic representation, investing in education, but especially changing that culture at the top, and that culture of impunity. The political class can kind of get away with things. Right? So there's images of seeing politicians being marched off to jail. As traumatic as it's been for the country, in some ways it's sort of woken people up as well, that this is a possibility and that the same old practices are not going to be as accepted today as they were years ago. And that may ultimately result in some changes in the way that politics is done in the country. But I think that it's going to have to go further than that. The transparency is important, but broadening democratic representation, as we just saw, in this really striking image of the mayors, has to go beyond that. It may require new forms of candidate selection, financing of candidacies, maybe even of campaigning, in order to give citizens a real choice. It's going to require bringing some more women and underrepresented citizens into that political process in ways that they haven't been as of yet. And I should note that even in some of these larger cities, there have been women mayors, right? But still, we see that that kind of ebbs and flows, and that more could possibly be done there. And once in power, elected officials are going to have to pay really close attention to this expectations gap, right? And trying to close that gap in some way. And if that means being more transparent in public contracts, or finding a way to more efficiently use the resources of government to lower the tax burden on citizens, there's many different ways that they might be able to do that. But I would say that, as in many cases, some of that change is going to have to start at the top. There's going to have to be an example set from the top down in some of these administrations. And that's something that needs some additional support and attention as we move forward, and try to really build on this still, I think, inherent optimism about the idea of democracy, if not the way that it's practiced in the context of Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And any questions?
I wanted to ask about Brazil's economy. I know you mentioned it had a trend of like boom and bust. I'm not totally sure, but is Brazil's economy really heavily reliant on extractive resources?
Yeah, so there is still quite a lot of reliance on commodity markets. And so Brazil's recent boom and bust sort of followed the global market trends in commodities. And there was an increase in prices for commodities across the board in the mid to late 2000s that Brazil was able to ride to some pretty high growth rates. But part of the economic collapse was the downturn in the commodities market globally. So that's definitely a part of it. But Brazil's economy is not entirely dependent on that. There's also a very large industrial sector, and there was other sort of domestic factors as well that were playing into the most recent downturn as well. Yeah, please.
Earlier we were talking about urban areas. What exactly are you defining as urban?
Yeah, so I'm working off of the sort of official definitions that's sort of accepted by international organizations. It tends to be a standard of either 5,000 or 10,000 people in a kind of some amount of density of a space. So it's maybe a little bit lower threshold than we might think it would be. But for the Brazil data itself and the survey data, we're talking about large cities. These are typically the largest metropolises of these countries. So the data, when I'm saying, oh, this is the public opinion from the large cities, it typically, for the data that's across Latin America, it's typically from the capital cities, and in Brazil, it's the largest cities of the country. So it's the large metropolis when I'm talking about the public opinion data.
Now you talk about the control of statistics, and then you share with us some perceptions. But what are your perceptions on this topic, and where do you position yourself in research?
Well, as a researcher, I was there to listen. Right? So I was trying to remain as neutral as possible in asking the questions and in receiving the responses. I wasn't always successful in that. Just to give you one example, there was one man that I was talking to who was saying all these same things of, yes, I think democracy is the way to go. Authoritarianism was a really bad time in the country's history. I came to a question in the interview that's asked, well, could you ever imagine a situation in which a military government might be preferable to a democratic government? And he said, yes, I can imagine that kind of a scenario. And I was like, okay, well, that's a reasonable response. I suppose anybody could imagine a scenario in which in which this might be necessary. So I probed a little bit further. So what kind of a scenario would that be? What kind of a situation would require you to say, yes, I think a military government would be preferable? Thinking that he's going to talk about some sort of like Armageddon or end of the world scenario. All order has broken down in this country, and yes, we need the military to step in and just reestablish order so people can get back to their lives. Well, no. His response was, well, I think the situation that we have right now in the country would qualify for a military intervention. It took me a couple seconds to recover from that particular answer. I felt bad. I broke my neutrality of a researcher, and just, I'm sure that expression just registered all over my face. And tried to make him feel like, okay, thank you for giving me that answer. Thank you for helping me understand how bad things are. And so, I really did, as I was out in the field, I tried to just be there to observe and understand the way that people talk about democracy and politics and their perceptions of how things are going right now. I think, I've got my own opinions. I mean, I observed some things while I was there that were shocking and were things that I hadn't observed on any prior trip to Brazil. The first time I went to Latin America and to Brazil was in 2001, before a lot of this economic boom and everything had happened. And in fact, you saw there was a lot of visible poverty. I still remember flying into Sao Paulo. And first of all, I was just shocked by the just sheer size of Sao Paulo. And I'm from New Jersey, right? I grew up in the shadow of New York City, Philadelphia, not too far from Washington, D.C., Boston. We're not easily impressed in New Jersey with, urban spaces. We're pretty accustomed to living in urban sort of concrete jungle. And yet I still found myself shocked as we were flying in for our approach to Sao Paulo. They're like, yeah, we're going to be landing in an hour, and we're already over urban sprawl. I mean, we're already over large, dense urban agglomerations, and the entire approach into Sao Paulo, we were flying over dense urban structures. And I was duly impressed, to say the least. But I still remember driving around the city that first day and just the poverty that was evident. It was very visible. There was people living under bridges. There was some of the peripheral neighborhoods just sort of felt like, I mean, they weren't literally, but it felt like they were spilling over onto the large avenues. It was just a matter of time before they did just cut off these major arteries around the city because there was nowhere else for people to live. It felt like that. And each time that I'd returned, and since 2001, I made observation. I've seen improvement. I've seen people being more hopeful, reflecting the growth in the economy and the greater opportunities that people are giving. The most recent time before this last trip I was down there was in 2014. In the lead up to the World Cup, I was down there for the World Cup. All the excitement surrounding that until the Germany game, which sort of took the air out of it all. But it was a good time, and as much as people were kind of worried and uncertain as to how that was going to play out with the World Cup, if they were going to manage to pull it off in time, they did. And you didn't really see that same level of poverty. You didn't see people living under bridges. People had a place to live. There was obvious that had been massive improvements in growth in the country since I'd first been there in 2001. And that was promising. That was encouraging to see. And over the last 3 years, there's been, it's gone backwards. You've seen a loss in a lot of those gains. People have dropped back into poverty. We don't have many of the official statistics yet, but I don't think that they're going to tell a very nice story about current conditions in Brazil. It's going to be a sobering story, and a story of cautioning us against over-optimistic expectations, like putting Christ statues blasting off the top of Rio. These sort of overstated expectations are probably not helpful in the long run. But so I'm concerned, and I'm concerned about the direction that Brazil's going, and I think that we're going to have to kind of see where things all end up with this at this point. So that's sort of where I'm at with my thinking about it. Yeah.
I know you mentioned the disillusionment with women. What's violence on women like there? Because violence was also a big part of that.
Yeah. As in many other places, women do have special sort of role in interaction with violence, right? It's domestic violence is a problem. It's not well quantified. It's not something that's necessarily always reported. And at the same time, I think that Brazil's done some things well in trying to address some of the issues. There's, in many localities, they've set up special police stations for women to report crime and violence against women specifically, that are staffed with officers who are trained to, are supposed to be trained to deal with these kinds of issues. And so, I'm certain that plays some role as well in their expectations. But it's just, for everybody, it's a general sense of insecurity. So when I was down there, I had a chance to visit with some family, and they talked about feeling trapped inside their home. That they couldn't go out on the streets. The criminals are free to wander the streets, and everybody else is sort of trapped behind their bars and home. So they're all imprisoned inside in their homes, and the criminals are sort of wandering free. So I think the insecurity is not something to diminish. For all I said about the politics of it, the security is a concern, and it's an ongoing one.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I basically just read a ton of stuff about violence in Rio, and so much the reason why politics doesn't work is external factors outside of politics. Even if there's perfect officials, perfect policies, which is impossible, there's hundreds of poor neighborhoods in one city, and I guess I'm not, what does democracy really even mean, and how effective is that going to be on its own, just changing to democratic form of government without taking into consideration changes in political culture. I don't think that happens from politics.
Yeah, so Rio is a very special case. It has a long history, and any government today would be inheriting problems that have built up over decades, and a lack of trust, quite honestly, between some of the communities in Rio and any sort of representative of the state. People have made any number of promises to these communities over the years that have gone unfulfilled or only partially fulfilled, and the state continues to face really severe challenges from non-state actors in a lot of these communities, some of whom have effectively replaced the state in the provision of some services. And so Rio is a very particular kind of problem, and one that probably doesn't have an easy solution. I think it will require some, a lot of effort on both sides, both from the community side and from the side of the state and the elected officials to try to rebuild some of those bridges and start small maybe, but begin to try to do that. And there was some hope that there might be some movement in that direction. They were putting in specialized police units in some of the communities that were actually going in unarmed to provide patrolling for some of so they would sort of come in and flush out all the drug trafficking and everything and arrest a bunch of people, and then they put in unarmed police to kind of provide a more consistent presence. There was some hope that might be the beginning of that sort of conversation, that if we could establish a peaceful community environment, then some of these other services from the state could come in and provide some additional bridges, and as you strengthen that over time, you might be able to get somewhere. But as with so many other things with public policies, it's been difficult to sustain the funding and the momentum that that initial drive created. And there was maybe even some problems in the model and the way it was constructed in the first place. But again, I think Rio is sort of a special case, and I'm trying to make more of a general argument about the country as a whole as opposed to talking about a specific locality.
It actually follows up on Sue's question a little bit. So in the data you presented earlier about crime, statistics, and urbanization in Latin America, the thing that came to my mind was, the relationship between crime and inequality, and whether there is data that makes a correlation at all in general, and then how does it translate to Brazil, and whether, to your knowledge, what is the kind of, what would be the graph of inequality in Brazil in the last decade? Like, is there a rise of inequality in urban areas or diminishing as well?
Yeah, so some of the most sort of iconic images of inequality actually come from Brazil. If you do like a search on the internet, like inequality in cities or something, like, and you do just an image search, you'll see all these pictures of sort of peripheral communities right next to these high-rise luxury apartment buildings, and sort of literally like fence to fence, right, like backyard to backyard on these communities. And so inequality, not just in Brazil but across Latin America, is one of the big issues that the whole region faces. Latin America continues to be the region in the world with the highest levels of inequality of any region. More so than other impoverished areas in the world, more so than in the United States, where we've heard a lot of talk about inequality. Inequality in Brazil is much worse than what we experience here. And so this has certainly been a driver of some of these social tensions in communities and nations across Latin America over the years, and is seen as a contributing factor to the crime rates. There's not opportunities, and crime offers you a quick way to get access to the consumer goods and the merchandise that you want access to. It provides a very attractive alternative. When you have a breakdown in family structures, and it also provides a support group and network for youth who get attracted into it at a very young age, particularly in Central America. And so there's definitely some concern about that. If we look at the trends in inequality, again, that first decade of the 2000s, 2000 to 2010, it looked like everything was going in the right direction. Not only was Brazil cutting its poverty rate, they cut it by more than half in that first decade, inequality was falling for almost the first time ever as well. And so there was sort of this redistribution happening in a way that was opening up the middle class to people, opening up opportunities. Unfortunately, I'm almost positive that when we begin to see some of the more recent data on inequality, it's going to have reversed that trend. I'm hoping that it hasn't completely erased the gains of the previous decade, but there's some real concern there, and inequality is going to be something that's really an important story going forward for Latin America.
Can I be the last one to ask? It's a kind of follow-up question here, but I can see it's a tough time for Brazil. It is, okay. Then, based on your survey and the interviews, urban Brazilians put a lot of blame on politicians, so political elites. So then, so inequality and other issues. So I was wondering whether your survey questions or interview questions could have been addressed in more, let's say, geographical terms. So if that had been done, then the answers could have been a lot more about, let's say, inequality or economic elites. So let's say a question could have been like, what would be the most serious problems in your daily life? You see, rather than just most serious problems, then they will talk about national politics. Mm-hmm. So, in your everyday lives, so, or what could have been, what needs to be changed in your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So I'm asking about whether you could have done the, kind of some limit the geographical scale, mm-hmm. so rather in the neighborhood or urban scale. Otherwise, all the answers would have been at the national level. So then that's
yeah. Well, yeah. So That's actually something I thought of after I got home from the the research. I was realizing that a lot of those questions probably provided this sort of bigger frame, and the kinds of answers I was getting was likely driven to some degree by that, and yet at the same time, I wanted the interview data that I had to be able to speak a little bit to the survey data, which is sort of pitched at a national level because it's a national survey. We're trying to get an overall snapshot of the country, and so I'm okay with the fact that it speaks to these national questions. Part of the point of doing the interviews is to get more in-depth answers than we can get in the typical kind of opinion survey, where we're mostly giving them response options and very quickly trying to move through questions to cover as many topics as possible. When I was there in Brazil, I was trying to dig a little bit deeper in understanding why they were responding the way that they were responding to certain questions. And so in that sense, I needed it to be able to speak to these national questions. But yes, if I was to do that follow-up study, it would certainly be advisable to ask those kinds of questions and getting really into people's local perspective. It was interesting. I asked two different questions. I asked the national question, right? What's the most important problem in the country? And I asked what I considered a more local question, and what's the most important problem in Manaus, in your city? Many people said, yeah, it's all the same thing. And again, that's probably some of that priming effect of, well, we don't, it's all politics, right? It's all, it's all these politicians. And, asking some sort of question like that might be a really effective way of getting at what's on the top of people's minds for their day-to-day living and lives. But, yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? Ohio University is Western poverty in particular is trying to have more urban scholars. So I teach urban geography, and Dr. Layton teaches urban politics, urban anthropology, urban sociologies. Indeed, tomorrow we are having a presentation about urban schools. So in education, so Ohio University, even if it's located in Southeast Ohio, rural Ohio, but we try to have some more urban studies here in Athens. So thank you very much.
Thank you.